It all started with something as simple as a mailbox. For months, I've been dealing with a problem that seemed small at first, but soon escalated into an ongoing nightmare. My mailbox, which had been standing proudly at the edge of my driveway for years, was constantly getting run over. At first, it was just a few minor incidents. The neighbors, particularly the HOA Karen sisters, seemed to have a little trouble steering their cars as they backed out their driveway. I thought it was just an accident, nothing worth making a fuss about. But soon it became clear that this wasn't just bad luck or careless driving. The Karen sisters, who lived right across the street, had a habit of running over my mailbox. It wasn't just once or twice. It was happening regularly, almost every week. I kept replacing the mailbox, but it always seemed to be back on the ground, crushed by their tires. The damage was getting worse. At one point, I even set up cameras to catch the culprits, and sure enough, the footage showed them carelessly running over it yet again. I couldn't believe the audacity. When I approached them to talk about the issue, they always seemed to have some excuse. It's a blind spot. One of them said, "Sorry, we didn't notice," said the other. Their tone was so dismissive that it made my blood boil. How could they be so careless, and worse, so uninterested in taking responsibility for their actions? I thought, this isn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. This is disrespect. I was stunned at how quickly they dismissed my concerns. They didn't seem to care that they were repeatedly damaging my property, and when I expressed my frustration, they acted like I was overreacting. They had no interest in apologizing or even acknowledging that they were in the wrong. The first few times I tried to talk to them, I kept my composure. I was trying to be the reasonable neighbor, to approach them politely. But each time they would brush me off with an excuse, a nonchalant apology, or worse, a vague "will be more careful," which obviously meant nothing. It felt like they were taking advantage of my kindness. They didn't have the decency to own up to their mistakes, and that's when I realized that being nice was getting me nowhere. I had been more than patient, more than accommodating, but this was no longer a simple problem. It was a matter of respect. They were ruining something that was mine, without even the decency to apologize or make things right. I couldn't let this continue. I needed to make them see that I wouldn't tolerate their careless behavior any longer. At first, I tried a more practical approach. I suggested they park in a different spot, away from the driveway, so they wouldn't risk damaging the mailbox again. I also mentioned that if they didn't change their driving habits, I'd have to consider getting a sturdier mailbox, something more difficult to knock over. But of course, that suggestion was met with the same indifference. They didn't take me seriously. They didn't think I would actually do anything about it. That's when I decided I needed to take action, and this time I wasn't going to ask for permission. I wasn't going to play the nice, passive neighbor anymore. I decided to do something they didn't expect. Instead of replacing the same old flimsy mailbox that kept getting run over, I went all out. I researched the strongest, most durable mailboxes I could find. I wasn't just going to fix it again. I was going to make sure that they couldn't damage it if they tried. I bought a heavy-duty, reinforced metal mailbox. This was no ordinary mailbox. It was designed to withstand the worst types of abuse. The post was built to be nearly indestructible, and the box itself was thick steel, the kind that could survive almost anything. I also decided to make it stand out, something they couldn't ignore. I painted it a bright, attention-grabbing color and even added a custom plaque that read, "Not your garbage bin." It was bold, a little cheeky, and most importantly, impossible to miss. I didn't stop there. I installed the new mailbox a little further back from the curb, so it wasn't directly in the path of their cars anymore. I made sure it was placed in a way that made it nearly impossible for them to hit it while backing out. The idea was to make it clear that I wasn't going to be passive about this anymore. I was standing my ground. No more apologies, no more excuses. It was my property, and I wasn't going to let anyone disrespect it again. The next time the Karen sisters backed out of their driveway, I saw their cars slow down, and I couldn't help but smile. They noticed the new mailbox immediately. There was no way they could miss it. They sat there for a few moments, stunned, before one of them finally walked over to my house, looking furious. She tried to give me a half-hearted excuse, but I stood my ground. I'm done with excuses. I made this mailbox so you can't miss it. It's time you started respecting my property. After that encounter, they never hit my mailbox again. I'm sure they were too embarrassed to even try. It wasn't about the mailbox anymore. It was about standing up for myself and making sure that my property was respected. The Karen sisters learned their lesson, and I learned that sometimes you need to take matters into your own hands and make a bold statement when being polite doesn't work. I thought about how to handle this situation for a while. It wasn't just about fixing the mailbox anymore. It was about standing up for myself and making a statement that would get their attention. I knew I couldn't just replace the mailbox with another standard one that would be crushed again. I had to do something bold, something they would not expect. I needed to make it impossible for them to ignore me, to make it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate their carelessness any longer. The idea came to me when I was browsing through the aisles of the local hardware store. I was surrounded by the usual assortment of ordinary mailboxes, basic utilitarian boxes meant to do nothing more than serve a purpose. But I wanted something that said more than just, "This is my mailbox." I wanted something that would make a statement, something that would stand strong in the face of their ignorance. So I grabbed a heavy-duty metal mailbox, one that could stand up to anything, including careless drivers. But I didn't stop there. I had a feeling that these HOA Karen sisters, known for their impeccable lawn and pristine house, would be taken aback by a little flair and creativity. They were proud of their perfect neighborhood, and I knew something flashy, something larger than life, would get their attention. I picked out a custom-designed mailbox, large, bold, and impossible to miss. It wasn't just a mailbox, it was a statement. It had sleek lines, bold color, and a design that was eye-catching yet classy enough to fit into the neighborhood. It was strong, built with reinforced steel, and mounted on a massive post. The idea was to make it a permanent fixture, something sturdy and resilient, unlike the flimsy, ordinary mailbox I'd had before. But that wasn't the most important part. I knew this was my chance to send a message to the Karen sisters. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just about a mailbox. It was about boundaries, respect, and standing up for what was mine. After bringing the new mailbox home, I didn't just place it back in the same old spot. No, I decided to make sure they couldn't miss it this time. I moved the new mailbox a little further back on the property, far enough so that it wouldn't be directly in their path when they backed out of their driveway. I didn't want to leave any room for error. I also reinforced the base with cement and added extra supports to make sure that no matter how reckless they're driving, they wouldn't be able to run over it. But what really made this mailbox stand out wasn't just the size or the reinforcements. It was the color. I chose a vibrant, eye-catching red, something that would pop out against the green lawns and neutral-colored houses of the neighborhood. It wasn't the kind of mailbox that would blend into the background. No, it was bold, and it was meant to be noticed. I also added a fun plaque that read, "This mailbox means business." It was quirky and playful, but at the same time, it made a clear statement. This mailbox was not just any ordinary fixture. It was a symbol of my resolve. Once I had everything installed, I stepped back and admired my work. The mailbox was now a work of art in its own right, a striking blend of functionality and defiance. It stood proudly at the edge of my driveway, its red color almost daring anyone to ignore it. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I took in the view. Not only had I solved the problem, but I had done it in a way that left no room for further disrespect. I was no longer the passive neighbor who let things slide. I had made my mark. Still, I couldn't help but wonder how the Karen sisters would react. I had a feeling they weren't going to be too happy about it, but deep down I was curious to see whether they would acknowledge the message. It wasn't just about them realizing that their carelessness had consequences. It was about showing them that I wasn't going to let them walk all over me anymore. The next morning, I sat by the window, watching as the sisters backed out of their driveway. Their car slowed down as they approached the new mailbox, and I could practically feel the tension in the air. They both stared at it for a moment, their eyes widening as they processed what they were seeing. For a moment, they just sat there, unsure of what to do. It was as if the sight of this bold, in-your-face mailbox had completely thrown them off balance. Then, the older sister, the one who had been particularly dismissive in the past, slowly got out of the car and walked toward my front door. She stood there for a few seconds, trying to collect herself. I could tell she was irritated. She wasn't used to being confronted with something so direct, so unapologetic. I walked outside to meet her, and without waiting for her to speak, I said, "I'm sure you've noticed a new mailbox. It's not just for looks. It's a reminder to be more careful." She opened her mouth to say something, but then stopped herself. The anger that had been there before seemed to dissipate. I could see her processing what I had done. She didn't expect this. It wasn't an angry rant or a confrontation. It was simply me standing firm in a way that made my point clear. I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. "I see you've made your point," she said, finally softening a bit. "I'll be more careful next time." That was the moment I realized that my plan had worked. It wasn't about making them fear me or even about the mailbox itself. It was about standing up for what was mine and demanding respect. The Karen sisters learned something that day. When you push someone too far, they may just surprise you with how they respond. It didn't take long for the HOA Karen sisters to notice. The very next time they backed out of their driveway, their car came to a complete stop, and I could see them through my window, staring at the new mailbox. Their eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I thought they might just drive away. But no, this was too much of a shock for them to ignore. They sat in their car, likely exchanging a few choice words before one of them, the older sister, stormed out of the vehicle, her face flushed red with anger. She marched across the lawn, clearly irritated and almost fuming with frustration. I had no doubt she was about to make a scene, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched her approach. "What's the meaning of this?" she demanded, practically shouting. Her hands were on her hips, and she stood there with a defiant glare, clearly looking for a confrontation. She was clearly angry, but I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. This wasn't the time for hesitation or retreat. It was time to stand my ground. I walked out slowly, making sure to maintain a calm and collected demeanor. I met her at the edge of my driveway, giving her a chance to voice her frustration. But instead of reacting emotionally, I simply said, "It means that I'm no longer going to let you run over my property without consequences. You've run over my mailbox one too many times, and now I've made sure it's not going anywhere." Her face went pale, and for a brief moment I saw hesitation flicker in her eyes. She had expected to come over here, rant, rave, and intimidate me into backing down, but instead she was faced with something unexpected. There was no yelling or screaming, just a simple statement, strong and unyielding. The mailbox wasn't just a physical object anymore. It was a symbol of my resolve, a statement that my property was not to be taken lightly. For a moment, she didn't say anything. I could see her trying to formulate a response, perhaps to defend herself or justify her actions. And sure enough, after a long pause, she started with the usual excuses. "It's just a blind spot. We didn't mean to. We've got a lot going on," and she trailed off, trying to explain herself in her usual dismissive manner. But this time, I wasn't going to let her off the hook with empty words. "I'm done with excuses," I said firmly, cutting her off mid-sentence. "If you can't be careful, then maybe you should consider parking in a different spot." My tone was steady, but there was no mistaking the resolve in my voice. I wasn't going to let her trivialize this issue any longer. I wasn't asking for apologies or promises. I was demanding respect for my property, and I wasn't about to back down. She stood there, speechless, staring at me as if she was processing what I had just said. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and I could tell that the familiar arrogance that had accompanied her dismissiveness in the past was now fading. There was nothing more she could say. The mailbox was too bold, too visible, and too well built to be ignored anymore. It wasn't just a piece of metal on a post. It was a message that couldn't be brushed off. For the first time, I saw her back down. She didn't argue further. She didn't try to justify her behavior. Instead, she just stood there for a moment longer, looked at the mailbox one more time, and then turned to walk back to her car. I could hear her muttering something under her breath, but it wasn't directed at me anymore. There was no more confrontation. The Karen sisters, for once, had been silenced. And that was it. The situation was settled. From that day forward, the HOA Karen sisters never ran over my mailbox again. In fact, I began to notice a change in their behavior. They started parking more carefully, paying closer attention to where they were driving and making sure to avoid anything that might damage my property. The mailbox had done its job. Not only did it stand strong, but it also served as a clear, undeniable reminder that I wouldn't tolerate being disrespected. The Karen sisters seemed to have learned their lesson. They didn't push me around anymore, and our interactions became civil, even if a little awkward. I could tell they had taken a step back, realizing that they could no longer dismiss me as the easy target they once thought I was. The power dynamic had shifted, and they were no longer in control. It felt like a personal victory, not just for my mailbox, but for my own sense of self-respect. It wasn't just about the mailbox. It was about standing up for myself, asserting my boundaries, and showing that I wouldn't let anyone, no matter who they were, disrespect my property. I had taken a bold step, and it had paid off. In the end, the message was clear. Standing up for yourself doesn't always require loud confrontation. Sometimes a bold move, coupled with a little creativity, can make all the difference. I had shown them that I wasn't going to be pushed around, and they had learned the hard way that disrespecting my property would not come without consequences. This story proves that when you stand your ground and get creative with your solutions, you can make a difference. The HOA Karen sisters learned a valuable lesson. Don't underestimate what a little creativity and a lot of determination can do.